would like now to continue, Bez Hashem, the practical history about what was going on over the generations with Klal Yisrael, Negea, Sifrei Torah, and afterwards we'll go on to Sifrei Talmud and Sifrei Kodesh, what happened along the history. So we said already that there was the tragedy of Srifa Sifrei Kodesh started with the Indian from Shviras Alichos, when Shik started, and it continued on to take another madrega with this the burning of the Torah through Apostomus, in the times of the Yevonim, that they made Shashicha, name Shal Yisrael, and that's when the Sveikis and all the Talmud Bavli comes from, all the Shilas and Sveikis and Halachas started in their times. And then that's what we spoke about last time. We also mentioned the Sreifas Talmud that was in the times of the Meram Rottenberg, which he said that's the reason why it came out of Shabbos Parshas Chikas, which is Tes Tammuz, in time of the Shviras Alichos and the Sreifas Torah. That was a continuation from that Avelis. So now we'll start Bez Hashem. We're focusing on the Miyat Torah in Golas. Bez Hashem will focus now. Start from the Chorban Beis Hamikdash, and we'll go on Siyat Shmaya. Morris says, "Masech T'Sevay Zor Dav Yitzchak Amud Aleph." In times of the Chorban Beis Hamikdash, B'Yosef and Kisma. That when B'Yosef and Kisma was nifter, Halchik Dei L'Roimi L'Kavra, B'Yosef and Kisma was big in Malchus. And when he was nifted, they went, even the parliament of Rome, the Roimi, went to his caver to bury him, and they will maspid him. And on the way back, it's a long Gemara. The Gemara says a story between Chaninim Matadian and Yosef and Kisma. The Kitzer, on the way back from the Hesped, the Gedolei Roimi, they found the Bechnim Matadian. He was Yoshev Isaac Matayra. He was being Isaac Matayra. Makas Kilos Barabim. He would gather Kilos Barabim and Besmedrash in front of everyone and Midash Matayra. And the Romans didn't let learning Torah. And they took him out to burn. He was holding Sefer Torah. The Sefer Torah Munach LeBechekoi. Heviu. They brought him. Kachu b'Sefer Torah. He took the Sefer Torah, wrapped him up. And they tied him up and they burnt him. And it goes on to a very terrible death, how they killed him. While he was dying, his daughter said, "Tati, it's terrible the way I'm seeing you." So he said, "If I'll be burnt by myself, that'll be one thing. But because I'm being burnt with the Torah, whoever's going to take the Kama from the Torah will take the Kama from the Romans." And Rechinim Matadian was one of the Asura Riga Malchus. And what's going on over here is that the Gemara is showing how the Asura Riga Malchus were killed. We know that Kiva was also killed, was also burned. And the Gemara is saying that whoever's going to be Mavakash Albayna Shal Torah will be Mavakash Albayni, because this was the beginning of the Sreifas Torah in Golos, which coincided with the Asura Riga Malchus, that was the Gedolei Yisrael, which itself, Gemara says that Kasha Misas Shal Tzadikim Kasreifas Beis Elokeinu. This is what this symbolizes, the Sreifas Torah of Klal Yisrael along the generations. So that was the beginning of the Chorban Abayis. And then by Shiny, and from there continued in a terrible way. We find in the times of the Gaonim, there's a chuvas from Peku ben Bavoy. I'm trying to read it. Ben Bavoy was a Talmud from Reb Abba, a Talmud from Reb Yehuda Goin from Surah. It was from the Gaonim. And the Reb Yehuda Goin's Talmud writes like this: Look, like Nahagi Lichtov said, they did. The minig wasn't to write a Sefer Torah berek. They never ever wrote a Sefer Torah berek. What's a rake? Rake. What is that? That is a Sefer Torah which wasn't. There was no ibut. We'll get into a drop shortly. So he said that they never wrote a Sefer Torah with this type of iris, this type of parchment. Only for the last few years. Why? The reason why the Sefer Torah that we have these days are written with these parchments, which there was no ibud on. What was the Shemad? Shegazra Edom Harasha. The Edom Harasha was Goizes Shemad al Eretz Yisrael. Shemad al Eretz Yisrael. Shleikru b'Torah. They should not read in Torah. But they should not read the Torah. The same gzeira they made in times of Yosef Kismi. The same thing. The same thing they made in times of the Goinim. It should learn Torah. The Gonzi calls Sefer Torah, and the Goinim they didn't hit all the Sefer Torah. I guess it means maybe they buried them because they would gather all the Sefer Torah and they were burning them. So what's he saying? In the times of the Goinim, there was a gzeira from Edom, Malchus Roim, and they didn't let the Yidden learn Torah and Eretz Yisrael, and they were burning all the Chamanot and all the Sefer Torah. So that was a continuation from the same story with Rabbi Yosef and Kism in the times of the Goinim. And he's saying that this parchment is a new thing because we didn't have any other parchment. Now let's go back to what he's. We'll start off a little bit with the lashon of the Rambam Hilchos Sefer Torah. The Rambam says, "Nimtzas lama she'esron dvarim." There's 20 things that a Sefer Torah needs. If one of them don't have it, it's missing one of them. Is Pesol Sefer Torah. He says, "What's the second thing? What is that?" He says, "Shenichtava al orbeim Torah she'ena ma'ubed." If it's written on a parchment which wasn't ma'abed, they didn't work it through the way it's supposed to be worked through, then the Sefer Torah is possible. So, now let's go back to the Bovai. He says, Sefer Torah shekasi yosef berek, Sefer Torah which is written with the parchment which is called reik in his language. But what is that? One of the requirements you need to have to abd Sefer Torah is with hafatzim, and and if they didn't use hafatzim, the Sefer Torah is possible. If you don't use hafatzim, it still has a Torah and nevela. It doesn't have a thin parchment for Sefer. It's not kosher for Sefer Torah. She'ein Sefer Torah kosher likrus boy. At sheichtav oisam, Sefer Torah is not kosher to read in it until you write it. But if you have to write it, ma'abed it with hafatzim l'shma, it goes on. V'kach halacha b'shtei yeshivas. That's how the paskin surim papadisa, 2 yeshivas in the goinim. B'chol svarim mishonim. Everyone agrees to this halacha, and you need a fatzim in order to ma'abed to make kosher the Sefer Torah. B'chol svarim mishonim ha'yeshonim sh'imois v'adashal. Until Moshe Rabbeinu, until today, all the Sefer Torah were done. The ibut of them were done through a fatzim. He says, "Lo nahagi lichter reik." This reik, which was parchment which wasn't from Ubed with Hafatzim, one in the last few years. We said before, Edom Rosh Shemad al Yisrael, Yikroi b'Torah. They shouldn't read the Torah. But Gonzi calls Sefer Torah. They would the Kohen all the Sefer Torah. He says, when Yishmael came and they were kovish Yisrael from Edom. And now they let them learn. The Shemadas were bottled. Sifri Torah. When there were no more Sifri Torah, Constantinople conquered. Constantinople was conquered by the Ottoman Empire. They took over Eretz Yisrael also, and the Gzeira from Shemad was bottled, but they didn't have Sefer Torah. They didn't have any Sefer Torah. They didn't know people that knew how to write. They didn't have any experienced people that knew how to make a kosher Sefer Torah. They didn't know which side of the or to write the Sefer Torah. They would take rake from the goyim. They would take this parchment, which didn't have ibud from the goyim. It was made. This parchment was written to write Sfarim from Avodah Zarah, like Koisu Sefer Torah, and they would write the Sefer Torah. He says the reason is because it was cheaper and it was easier to write. And he says, the Chacham said, also look at Sefer Torah. It's also to read a Sefer Torah. He says, you're not allowed to read from this. You're not allowed to make a bracha. Also levarach alav. And even if it's chaser, one thing is it's ganz impossible. So he's saying that this Sefer Torah, which the Olam is reading, is possible. And the same thing is brought down Rav Netroy going. The Rosh brings down from Sefer Itim, Shem Netroy going. The same thing like the Bova says. The Goinim, he writes, and over here it's written like this: but there was only one Goin that was mattered. He says, and everyone else, what possible? And so the question is, why was it? This is the Rosh bringing down from the Torah Goin, and he says, why are the people using this Pasal Sefer Torah? Because no one knows how to make it. That's why they use this Pasal Sefer Torah. And he says there was only one guy in Moshe that was mattered. They had no other choice, and there was Samech in him. And he says, the Torah says, even though we don't paskin like him, and all the Sefer Torah is an apostle, if you have no other way, if you can't get a hold of a kosher Sefer Torah, don't stop for reading a Sefer Torah. Why? Because it says, Eish Lash Hashem Hafir Torah Sefer. It says the Goinim, the two yeshivas, did not have any kosher Sefer Torah. There was no kosher Sefer Torah. Only one Goin was mattered, and all the other Goinim were asadik. And they didn't have any Sefer Torah. And even though they didn't have any Sefer Torah, he said you should still do Kriyas Torah. Why? Because if in the time that you don't have Sefer Torah, you could use the Apostle Sefer Torah, because Eis Las Hashem Afid Torah Secha. This is Reb Shai, the Torah Goin writes, and the Shai Goin says the same thing. The Sefer Eshkol brings from the Shai Goin the same thing. All the Sefer Torah apostle, and we don't pass like a Moshe Goin. For the Hoyde Loi Chachmei Adar, where Rav Yosef Goin, Rav Rebbe Ben Dedenu, he says Rav Nachshon Goin wasn't, the Chachmei Shivasi wasn't Mekel, Rav Nachshon Goin was Machmer also. So all the Goinim were machmer on this Apostle Sefer Torah, and the reason why it was nespasha to read it was because it was Islas Hashem Afir Torah Secha. And this thing wasn't only the times of the Goinim, it was nimshach to the times of the Rishonim. We find in a Tshuva from the Rambam, there were people that were reading in a Chumash. What we call a Chumash was not a Sefer Torah. It was written on parchment, but it was written like bounded, like we have our Sfarim. It was a Chumash, and the question is, there were places that didn't have Sefer Torah. They didn't have Sefer Torah at all. So they wanted to know, if you don't have a Sefer Torah, could we lane b'tzibur with a Chumash? That was the Shaila. And the Rambam, this is what the Rambam was asked. So the Rambam says, Pel de Gezach. He says, what do you mean? Everyone's learning from Apostle Sefer Torah. Sefer Torah is the Onam Ubud B'Klal. They don't have any of it. His lashon is, that he says that he says the Rambam over there in the Tshuva says that the bracha on the Kriya is not on the Kriya from a Sefer Torah, it's on the bracha on the Limud Torah. He says it's just like bracha Torah in the morning, and even if there's no kosher Sefer Torah, it's still on the Etzem Limud Torah. You're allowed to make a bracha. And he says, on this, the Roiv and Anshei Marav were Saimechan to learn from a Sefer Torah, from a Apostle of Sefer Torah, which there was no Ibud, B'chlal. And they were made a bracha before and afterwards. B'fnei Go'ina Olam, Rabbeinu Yosef Halevi, Rabbi Yitzchak Halevi, that in front of the Rimagash and the Rif, they learned from a Sefer Torah, which is Pasal. The Pasal Pshat and the Rambam over here is that the Rimagash and the Rif had Pasal Sefer Torah, and they still learn from it. And they made brachas. So from there it makes a raya that even if from a chumash you're allowed to lay in b'tzibur and you're allowed to make a bracha on. So we see from here the Rambam is that the Rif and the Rimagash, they also didn't have a Sefer Torah. Maybe it means to say in the yeshiva, or maybe to say the tzibur, the pashtus, but whatever the case is, it definitely was a matzim oid from the Rimagash and the Rif, not to have Sefer Torah. The pashtus says they were just like the Gaonim, and they didn't have any kosher Sefer Torah. In Gaone in Nurba, which is the Sefer Eshkol, which the Bala Eshkol was one of them, and the other Rishonim, they also write Reiv Sefer Torahs. That's Berach in the times of the Rebbeinu Tam. Reiv Sefer Torah Shalanu. Most of our Sefer Torah Shalanu assume Eli Oiris are made from these Oiris that are not obed the way it's supposed to. So this continuation from the times of the Gaonim, from the middle of the times of the Gaonim until the Rishonim, most of the Sefer Torah were apostle Sefer Torah. They didn't have ibud b'chalal, and then we find that it gets even worse. Shmuel the Lekit writes, means that from his brother. Are you allowed to make again the Shaila ben Yigay making a bracha on a chumash? He says, "When bani la'aser, if you aser to lay from a chumash," he says, "Neser roiv kriyas Torah." Most of the kriyas Torah are going to be aser. He says our Sifter are not even. You have to use gidam. You have to use veins from a kosher animal in order to tie the Sifter. He says our Sifter, even the way that it's made, besides the ibud, are apostle, and he says that there are so many different kamashar psulim ispuel roiv avnesenu, and we read in it and we make a bracha b'shem islas shem l'firit ha'secho tishtaka chatoira. And he says in bani la'aser ne'aser roiv kriyas ha'torah, most of the Torah will be aser. He says, "Imke ne'aser roiv kriyas shebegoyla she'inasik l'chasam." That's what he says. And the Sefer Tanya Rabasi says the same thing. He says that our minig is to reach from a chumash, that and he says he said that you can't make a bracha, but that's how the kriya was. The Sefer Tanya Rabasi, one of the Rishonim, didn't have a Sefer Torah b'chlal. I skipped a little bit from the Mishmei Leketz. Could I read? He says, no, okay, we'll skip that. And that's the tshuva from the Goiner. Nirba also write, there was also, in his times, there were places, far out places, there was no kosher Sefer Torah, and they were mated to read from a chumash. And we find the Trumas Hadeshin speaks about the Itzi Miktsas Chabura Shahilam Sefer Torah Tfur B'Meshi. They had Sefer Torah that were bounded with Meshi linen, and what wasn't done with Gilan. It's totally puzzle. And he says you're allowed to use it because Mishim Eislas Hashem Afir Teresecha, and it's brought down the Ramah. So we find over here all until later Rishonim that most of the Sefer Torah were puzzle, and the times of the Gaonim, they all agreed, most of the Gaonim agreed, that's what the Psak Halacha, that the Sefer Torah they had were puzzle. Times of the Rimagash and the Rif, the Sefer Torah were puzzle. Later came Rebbeinu Tam and discusses his Sefer Torah, which wasn't made by Afatzim, it was in Ubad Besid, and he said it's mutter. There's a whole discussion if Rebbeinu Tam is arguing on the Gaonim, or Rebbeinu Tam is talking about a different psula gamri. But according to those that Rebbeinu Tam was arguing the Gaonim, even our Sefer Torah is not kosher l'kul alma. But we'll stop over there. I'll just say at this point that from the times of the Gaonim, until mid of the Gaonim, until later into the Rishonim, well into the Rishonim, most Sifrei Torah were apostle. They didn't know how to make it. It was made through. It wasn't ibud. It was plain klafim that were used for avodah zara, sfarim for avodah zara. It was used with gidim was used. They used to tie many of them with meshi, and we find in Moed Gezach that the Rambam says they allowed to make a bracha on a chumash because our Sefer Torah is anyways not possible, and we make a bracha on it anyways. So, meaning to say that once the Sefer Torah they were matter to make a bracha on a Sefer Torah that were possible because of the ibud. From there, everything spiraled out of control. Once you can make a bracha Hashem on something which is possible, so there were no boundaries anymore. If there's no kosher Sefer Torah, it can be said on other to make brachas on Chumshin also, meaning to say that there was so many different psulim in the Sefer Torah because they didn't know how to make a kosher Sefer Torah, and from there was no, and they were not to make a bracha anyways. So that is something which we have to take into account. We can't imagine how in the earlier generations they didn't have a Sefer Torah. They didn't have Sefer Torah in the times of the Geonim. All the Geonim that we know, all Divrei Kabbalah, they didn't have a kosher Sefer Torah. In the times of the Rishonim, the Ragash, the Rif, they didn't have the most precious thing that Klal Yisrael had. Malchus Rebbe Goyim in Torah. It didn't exist. And we're zeichet to have it. So we have to understand of the Charein after they were endured and all the other gzeros and the pogroms and everything else, but now the Eibush to give us back the most Mohadik Sefer Torahs, the most cherished thing that we have. We should take and cherish it, and we should appreciate the love that Hashem gave to us. As Hashem, the next year we'll continue going on the Inyanim from the Kisvi Yadis and the Chlal Svarim, how much it was all along the generations.